I'm Edward Hutchins of the Human Achievement Alliance, and it's an honor for me to speak at this Gen 4 IR conference put on by the Transdisciplinary Agora for future discussions. Now, as you all know, sub-Saharan Africa is the birthplace of humanity, but in recent centuries, it has not shared in the incredible explosion of wealth that has brought greater prosperity than any other time in human history to millions of people. Indeed, Africa and African countries were sorely exploited and today still rank last on most lists for prosperity and for human well-being. But this is about to change. Exponential technologies offer Africans the opportunity to catch up with the developed countries and to be new leaders and innovators if they are given the opportunity to acquire the knowledge necessary and the liberty to act on that knowledge, to exercise their ingenuity and creativity. And the task of the Transdisciplinary Agora is to unleash this future. First, let's talk about exponential technology. Now, the transformation of the world by the Industrial Revolution took place over several centuries. Those were very difficult times, and very difficult adjustments were made as people moved from rural, uneducated areas to factories, workers moving from small craft shops also into factories. And in many cases, they became the actual entrepreneurs creating the new industries and the new wealth. But there was time for this adjustment. But the situation is somewhat different with exponential technology. Improvements in communications and information, nanotechnology, biotechnology, the Internet of Things, robotics, and artificial intelligence. These changes are happening very, very rapidly. For example, in 1971, the fastest integrated computer chip had about 10,000 transistors. But Intel's Gordon Moore rightly predicted that this number would double every 2 years. So rather than having only 500,000 transistors, if the development had gone on in the linear way, today's Apple M1 Ultra chip has 111 billion transistors. Now, economic and market transformations now take place in only a few decades or even a few years. For example, it took almost 70 years for telephones to be introduced to 90% of American households. By contrast, modern smartphones were premiered in 2007 by Steve Jobs, and in only 15 short years, nearly 90% of adults in America have one. And the capacities of those phones far outstrip anything like the originals, and indeed are the most advanced devices ever held in the hands of consumers. Now, let's talk now about how Africa could leap ahead. First, it's important to note that catching up can happen very quickly. After World War II, the war-ravaged countries of Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea didn't need 150 years that it took the Western European countries to become prosperous societies. Rather, they were able to do it in a few short decades. And we'll see in a moment exactly how they did that. Consider a more specific example. In the 1990s, telecommunications in most Latin American countries were absolutely terrible. But many of those countries, rather than spending billions of dollars, which they didn't have, burying cables and stringing new wires, they decided to put up cell phone towers, a cheaper technology, but a better technology, and double down on the new emerging communications of mobile phones and mobile technologies. Now, consider how this approach might apply directly to Africa. Um, Healthcare systems in the West have relied very heavily on brick and mortar hospitals. In the United States, for example, there are 6,000 such hospitals. Every year, the expenditures are about $1.2 trillion. But uh, a low-cost lab on a chip device right now can analyze incredible amounts of different fluids, um, and looking for healthcare conditions or health problems with people. You can take a look now that we have wearable diagnostics, whether Apple Watches, Fitbits, and so forth, that are much less costlier, and yet can garner lots of critical patient information. And of course, connected to Wi-Fi, can get that information to distant facilities and artificial intelligence that can quickly do very accurate diagnostics. In other words, this could cut down on the number of costly physical facilities needed in Africa. And in other words, Africa would be founding its healthcare system in the future on these improving exponential technologies. Now, let's talk for a little bit about Afrolongevity. One of the great things we're doing with the Transdisciplinary Agora is we're founding an Afro Longevity Foundation. The goals of this foundation are to treat aging the way you would treat any other ailment, to try to slow it down, to stop it, and to even reverse it. And second, to ensure that extended lives are healthy lives. Now, we all understand that Africa faces some of the most serious healthcare problems in the world. Life expectancy in Africa has risen from 40 years old in 1960 to 50 years old in 2000 to 62 years old in 2020. This progress is welcome, but the global average is 73. And in OECD countries, the average is 80. In 2015, there were 311 million individuals in sub-Saharan Africa who did not have access to safe water sources. And 70% of the populations of the African countries at that time didn't have adequate sanitation. In 2019, some over 500,000 individuals in sub-Saharan Africa, of which 416,000 were children under 5, died of malaria, mostly borne by mosquitoes. Africa still is ground zero for HIV/AIDS. And something like 65 to 70% of the 33 million people in this world who are afflicted by AIDS are in Africa, and something like that percentage of the 650,000 deaths each year are in sub-Saharan Africa. Where then does an Afro Longevity Foundation fit in with the ongoing efforts to deal with these problems? Well, to begin with, it provides a longer term focus. It's not just about surviving the various ailments that afflict us, but it's also about heading off ailments and treating them before they even come, or heading them off before they even come, heading off the processes that constitute aging. Further, it can be a place of focus for policymakers, workers in the healthcare and sanitation areas, physicians, medical researchers, and of course, entrepreneurs who want to do for healthcare what Steve Jobs did for personal computers and smartphones. It can be a hub of such reformers and such individuals. Those efforts will also involve developing and working with other technologies, for example, biohacking, nanotechnology, robotics, and AI. That's what the Longevity Foundation can bring together. And it will be an international effort, which will continue the process of overcoming tribal and regional differences that we see plaguing Africa even to this day. Also, this effort should focus on the emerging new elite. For example, people who've been trained in medicine and in research in Western countries who might come back to Africa to be part of this effort. But now we have to face a problem, and that is that Africa's deficit in liberty and surplus in corruption. This is a problem. Um, there's this is the pretty critical barrier that they have to overcome. My late friend, a great Ghanaian economist, Georgia Yete, wrote, "Africa is poor because she is not free." And the data certainly bear this out. The Index of Economic Freedom divides the world and the countries of the world into 5 quintiles, from the most free to the least free. And what it found in 2019 is that the average per capita income in the freest 1/5 of countries is $63,588. By contrast, the repressed quintile had per capita incomes only of $7,716. Now, unfortunately, the 47 sub-Saharan African countries that could be ranked on the index um, uh, uh, with a total of over a billion people rank very, very poorly. There were only 2 that were ranked as mostly free. There were 6 that were ranked as moderately free. There were 30 that were ranked as mostly unfree, and 9 ranked as repressed. Not surprisingly, per capita income in African countries on average run only about $4,148. Not very good. Africa's biggest problem, of course, is corruption. For example, on government integrity, African countries rated a dismal 29 out of 100 compared to 44 out of 100 for the rest of the world. And by the way, the 6 countries that were ranked as free had government integrity scores of 88.9. This is the problem: is Africa is mired in corruption, which saps the energy of the African people and entrepreneurs. Now, by the way, if most African countries between the years 1965 and 1985 had grown at the same rate as so-called 4 Asian tigers, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, rather than having GDPs growing only from about $120 billion to $211 billion, with per capita income stagnant at $500, those countries would have had GDP totaling $648 billion, and per capita income instead of $500 would have been about $1,800. Let me now outline the Technopath ahead. The good news is that the Transdisciplinary Agora and the Afrolongevity Foundation's efforts are really going to help bring prosperity to the African countries. First, these efforts will bring consciousness raising. Now, consider an example that in the 1970s, a gentleman named Steve Biko in South Africa worked to raise the consciousness of his oppressed fellows. The problem was that the white government conditioned many blacks subconsciously into accepting the racist views that they were somehow inferior. Biko fostered a sense that black people should have pride in themselves, that they can do it. Now, one can criticize Biko for maybe erring too much on the side of identity politics. But the point is that he had to break his own citizens, his own fellow citizens, out of these psychological prisons. Similarly, the vision of what technology in the hands of free Africans can do will be inspiring, elevating, and empowering. Now, second, most of those efforts will include the creation of future studies curriculum that over time will be introduced into the African countries. And this is very important for Africans to learn about this technology and what's coming in the future. Third, over time, this vision and these studies will produce a generation that will not only be the entrepreneurs and the value creators in Africa. This generation will produce those who will influence culture, those who will be the new political leaders, and those who will usher in a more honest, open, and prosperous system. In conclusion, the great hopes of African countries after they gained independence from colonial powers in the 1960s were unfortunately dashed by bad economic policies, by corruption, divisive tribalism, and of course, Cold War issues that got in the way. Now, sadly, we are in a new Cold War right now. This time it's the communist China that leads the scramble for Africa. But this time it is different. With exponential technology and through the efforts of the Transdisciplinary Agora, um, we Africans can have full participation in the creation of prosperous, peaceful, future societies in which each human being can realize their full potential here in the birthplace of humanity. And I thank you for your attention.